For all of us of a certain age, the Phil Donahue and Vladimir Posner Spacebridge broadcasts were really landmarks in the process of bringing the Cold War to a close. I think several of us, and talking to people about this event, several people had the same reaction that I did, that we remember these were really memorable events. Even for those of us who knew something about the Soviet Union, it still had a window on the Soviet Union we didn't know. And there were several memorable moments in the broadcasts. And we really have forgotten how unusual these broadcasts were. We've gotten very used to the fact that we now kind of travel through the ether disembodied on microwaves flying through space. But at the time, this was really a revolutionary technology. And the idea of using this new technology for diplomacy was even more revolutionary still. So we're very fortunate to have with us two gentlemen who arguably changed history and were real revolutionaries of their time. And I think that becomes clear the more we look back. Now, ironically, thanks to Mother Nature, we understand that we haven't progressed quite as far as we might have thought. And at the end of the day, Vladimir Pozner is, as he was in the Spacebridge, sitting in Moscow, or in Leningrad. He's in Moscow today, because of the volcano. But fortunately, there were other options, and we've been able to have him join us here today. Before I begin the program, I want to thank Evelyn Messenger and her colleagues from Internews Interactive, who conceived of the program, came to us with the idea, and really have made it work. And I'm sure many of you in this room understand that pulling off a meeting like this is no simple affair. And Evelyn and her colleagues have been a joy to work with. So it's my pleasure to ask Evelyn to come up and make a few opening remarks. Evelyn?
Hi. I don't have very much to say. I especially just want to thank our guests for finding their way here, and it wasn't so easy, and all of our guests, and who you'll meet soon. And especially I want to thank the Kennan Institute, Blair Rubel and Joe Dressen, who've been extremely helpful in putting this together. And I want to thank the Trust for Mutual Understanding and the Rockefeller Family Services, without whom we wouldn't be here. You can plan a lot. It takes a lot of planning, even though it seems pretty simple. But we did not plan for a volcano. So, and it is ironic that because of the volcano, we've ended up bringing Vladimir here just as we all began, and you'll see in a video that's coming up virtually. And this is really, in a way, meant to honor Phil and Vladimir for this extraordinary work that they did that Blair was referring to. So our Internews Interactive is a nonprofit, and we have a project called the Citizens Diplomacy Archive Project. And what we're gathering with the help of the Hoover Institution, the Stanford University's Hoover Institution, an archive collection of citizen diplomats. Some of you out here who have hair the same color as mine might know about citizen diplomacy. And if you do, please come up. We want to put all your old notes that are now in your attic in the Hoover Institution. So thank you very much for coming.
Evelyn, thank you. I also would like to thank Joe Dressen, who organizes all our meetings, and he was put to the test with this meeting in many ways, and acknowledge the special role today of the AV staff here, John Tyler and Paul Grachoff, who have really stepped in at the last minute. Our format today is going to be an examination of citizen diplomacy at the end of the Cold War, focusing on the period 1985 to 1989. And we're going to have two clips from the space bridges. The particular clips are going to be from 1985, featuring audiences in Leningrad and in Seattle. And then we'll have a little bit of question and answer period, both a discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open it up. And then about 3:35 or so, we'll take a very short break to rearrange the deck chairs up here. And then we'll be joined by David Hoffman and Heather Hurlburt, who will be talking about the post-Cold War period of the 1990s and the last decade. And we'll also have a more contemporary clip from just a couple of weeks ago. And so we'll be able to talk about how things have changed and how things haven't changed. Just to get the introductions out of the way, let me just very quickly say a few words about each of the panelists today. Phil Donahue is known, I'm sure, to everybody in the room. He's most recently the co-director and executive producer of the documentary Body of War. He is in many ways an American icon. He's best known as the creator and star of The Phil Donahue Show, which had a remarkable 26-year run on U.S. national television. He co-hosted the Spacebridges with Vladimir Pozner. We're going to be talking about that today, as well as an interview series on CNBC in the 90s, Posner and Donahue. He hosted a talk show on MSNBC in 2002, 2003. He's won 9 Emmys, a Lifetime Achievement Emmy as well. Vladimir Posner is currently the host of the Russian interview program Time to Live.
No, it's called Posner. Sorry, it's our error.
It's your error?
Yes,
Okay.
it's called Posner.
It's called Posner. He was a commentator on the North American service of Radio Moscow, and he hosted several of the Spacebridge programs, including the Citizen Summit series we'll be talking about today. He's won multiple Soviet, Russian, and American awards. He has 2 Emmys and its Russian equivalents. He's hosted a long list of popular interview shows and served as president of the Russian Academy of Television. I just want to add a personal note that when I was talking to somebody, they said, "Oh yeah, Vladimir Posner, is he still around?" And I think it's important to note that he's not only still around, he's really an important figure in Russian discussion. And the proof of that was the show that you did just about a week ago or 2 weeks ago on Russian-Polish relations, which is really a remarkable piece of television anywhere. And it was a very important subject, and I think that show is responsible for really for a new tone in talking about the Soviet era, Soviet history, and Russian-Polish relations. So he's not only definitely still around, but he's still the kind of journalist he was when he had hair, as we were just talking about. David Hoffman is contributing editor for the Washington Post, and he just won the Pulitzer Prize. So congratulations, David. It's for his book, The Dead Hand, The Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy. He was White House correspondent for the Post during the period we're talking about today. He covered the major U.S.-Soviet summits of the Reagan years. He was then diplomatic correspondent in the Post, and from 1995 to 2001, he watched the new Russia take shape as Washington Post bureau chief in Moscow. And Heather Hurlburt, whom we'll also hear from, is executive director of the National Security Network. She served in the Clinton administration as special assistant and speechwriter to the president, speechwriter for Secretaries of State Albright and Christopher, and she was a member of the policy and planning staff at the State Department. She's also worked with the International Crisis Group, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Helsinki Commission, and she's a regular guest on Blogging Heads TV. So it's now time, all the formal introductions are done, and it's time to begin our discussion of what the Spacebridge was about. And we'd like to begin it by showing a video clip of, it is showing an exchange among citizens in Seattle and in Leningrad in 1985. And this really focuses on mutual perceptions of then Soviets and Americans, one and the other. So if we're ready, maybe we can go ahead and roll that first clip.
Leningrad, USSR. Seattle, Washington, in the United States. Hosted in Seattle by Phil Donahue, and in Leningrad by Vladimir Posner. These citizens from the Soviet city and these citizens from the U.S. city will talk by television satellite on a citizens' summit. Participants are free to discuss whatever they wish. No subject will be off limits. They'll meet each other face to face next on a citizens' summit.
I understand that Riza, Secretary Gorbachev's wife, was a lecturer on Stalin, on Leninism and Marxism before she was married. What kind of pay would might a person get in that situation today?
May we ask why the question was met with such laughter?
You're wrong if you think that Gorbachev's wife tells all of us what her salary is and what kind of work she gets it for.
Yes, sir. I would like for you to list 2 or 3 things that your government can do to ease the tension of nuclear war as steps to bring about peace in the world.
Yes, sir.
The first thing would be a moratorium on nuclear testing. And the second thing would be a reduction of nuclear armaments on the whole, and then a reduction of all weaponry. What about your side?
What about our side?
Yes. I think that we're all in accord on those 3 particular items and why we have to do that. I think the problem is, how do we go about making sure we both do it at the same time?
It seems to me that we've somehow gotten a bit off the track from what could be the topic of our talks today. If we're only going to be talking about lofty political subjects, and those have already been discussed by the leaders of our countries, those have been discussed quite clearly, and I think positions have been stated perfectly accurately. If we do that, I think that it's going to be a kind of amateurish repetition of what professionals have already said. Maybe there are other topics we could discuss here, and then we'd really get to know each other better, and we'd get to understand each other better.
Might I inquire about your perceptions of Americans, not America as a political institution, but what do you feel about us? What do you think about us? What do you think about our lives?
This is of great interest to me because I was several times in the U.S. I must say that I really liked Americans. They're very open, they're very sociable, very straightforward. But I can tell you that there are some things that really astonished me. We were in Seattle, and there were such simple questions as, what Soviet films did you see? And people we spoke with couldn't tell us because we didn't see any. Now, could the Americans answer the question, why is there such a difference in the level of information available?
It's our belief that most of your information comes through your government, is censored by your government. In our country, we have the right to read whatever we want. We can go into a store that specializes in foreign books and get them. The problem is that not all of our citizens want to read them. Your government puts on your news. Our government doesn't put on our news. It's privately produced. They can say anything they want.
Well, I would also like to ask why some of you seem to feel that you're so right and don't give us the benefit of the doubt.
Well, Phil, maybe I'll start us off with a question for you. And I have to say, we've just traveled back in time, and there's something almost touchingly naive about that exchange when we look back at it from today. And I'm just wondering how much have we learned about one another? People there were talking about how little we knew about one another. How much more do we seem to know about one another now?
Well, I don't know if I'm smart enough to give you a really valuable answer to that question. I will say that it struck me dramatically while I was in the Soviet Union, while we prepared for these. And by the way, after we did these space bridges, my show, the Donahue daytime show, went to the Soviet Union and, did 5 shows with, the earpieces and the simultaneous translation. I was stunned by how curious they were about us. And embarrassed, really, about how curiosity seemed to be absent here for them. They were the evil empire. Certainly we had that. People, we would do with the headsets at universities and other places. Is the Empire State Building still your tallest building? This is 1985. How many holidays do you have? Are you a believer? I came back from this experience I came back with a flesh and blood image of the Soviet Union. Real people who wanted to reach out, and who I think in many ways were more informed. I went to a woman in the back row when we were doing a Donahue show. And well, first of all, I said, where would you like to come with 350 Soviets, 1985? Where would you like to come? If you came to the United States, where would you like to go? Hands went up like that. First person, Las Vegas. Second person, Disney World. And I ran to a woman in the back row and she said, Boy, hodi cross you to Glide, Oxford, Mississippi. And I said, why? William Faulkner. And in my ears, I heard the translator say, because that is the home of your great author, William Faulkner. And I wondered how many Americans knew that. And I was just very, very impressed with, they seem to see us in an individual, more personal way. Sure, they have their prejudices too. They didn't escape. But we didn't see that. We see a bear, a big country with 11 time zones that has nukes. I prayed for the conversion of Russia as a child at the end of every Mass. The priest would come down from the altar, for the conversion of Russia, our Father. I grew up with this. And all of a sudden, I got a TV show with a guy from a country that I'm praying that God will convert. This is a time warp. I mean, that's as breathtaking as this experience was for me. It's a chapter in my life.
Vladimir, is the curiosity about America still there in Russia today, or are we really in a different era?
It's a difficult question to answer. The fascination is still very much there, but when you look back to 1985, very few people could travel. Very few people were allowed out of the Soviet Union, and there were not many who'd ever gone to the United States. And there was this fascination with the United States that dated back many, many years. So the curiosity was very evident, and not only vis-a-vis the United States, because it was such a closed country, and because most Soviets couldn't get out, they had this curiosity about the rest of the world. Now, obviously, things have changed radically, and today in most Russian movie theaters, there's American movies, so people really get to see what Americans see, basically. They have a different view of America today. But to say that they understand the United States, that they have a real understanding of what Americans are like, I don't think you can say that. But I don't think you can say that about any country vis-a-vis another. I mean, do Americans really understand what the French are about? I doubt it. And so do the French. So, the fact today that you can travel, the fact that you can read any book, the fact that you can watch American movies, or you can watch CNN on your television set anywhere in Russia, in a way has abated the curiosity. But I'm not sure that it's really led to a better understanding. And what's more, I think people in both countries are very often victims of their media, the way media portrays the other side. And the way media portrays the other side depends on the political climate, which over the past years has not been too good. So I think there's a lot of prejudice still around, and I think it's in the United States as well as in Russia, due to the kind of information people get from what is today in Russia to a large extent no longer state-controlled, although television, the main television networks are state-controlled. But most of the newspapers are not, radio is not, and so on. People have images that are created by media more than anything else, and those images are not images of true understanding.
Vladimir, I wanted to ask you, when I was looking at that audience in Leningrad, I was wondering how different, when I look at your contemporary talk show, the audiences actually seem very different, but how different would an audience today be of contemporary Russians in St. Petersburg? Do you think?
Well, the Russians in St. Petersburg, first of all, who had been selected, by the way, by the Donahue show people who came to St. Petersburg, to Leningrad rather, to select them, because as Phil told me on the phone back then, if we can't tell our people here that we chose the Russian audience, they're going to say, well, those are all KGB picked people, so you can't trust them and so on. So here was this audience who basically came to be friends. Old ladies bought flowers and books, and I asked them, what do you want to do with this? We want to give them to our American friends. How are you going to do this? Through the television screen? I mean, they had no idea. When the discussion started, the Americans were very tough. They began asking about, what is Gorky? Why is Solzhenitsyn, and why is Sakharov in Gorky? And why can't you travel? And what about anti-Semitism? The Russian audience, or the Soviet audience, better said, was not prepared for that. And initially was shocked. And then got back, well, what about Vietnam? And, got into that kind of a thing. And it gradually changed. But the people in the Soviet audience were afraid to be open. This was the Soviet Union. They were not going to say things that they might talk about at home among friends in the kitchen. And they differed fundamentally in that sense from the American audience. Today, if we were to do one of these space bridges, you would see that the Russian audience is absolutely outspoken, critical of its own government, has no fear of speaking its mind. And I think that is a tremendously important change.
Phil, do you remember how difficult it was to identify the Leningrad audience? You mentioned that your staff was involved
in choosing.
Yeah.
Well, you have to remember what it was like in 1985. First of all, the Donahue show was very hot. We were in over 200 cities, and I guess that's how I was really so very lucky to have been chosen for this opportunity. But I called Ted Koppel to ask him what he thought of Vladimir Posner. Now remember, I'm scared to death because I've already a lefty. Now I'm in bed with the commies. Next week I'll be parking cars. I look back on it, I feel a little self-conscious about it now. I guess I'm a wimp. But I was at the height of my career, and I already had this reputation. We had gay people on, transvestites, and here comes Donahue with the commies now. So I called Koppel and I said, what do you think of Posner? He said, I like him. Posner was first on Nightline in 1980. He was the Russian who didn't sound Russian, or didn't talk like Russians. And so that helped a lot. Wow, I get this imprimatur from Koppel. What are you doing? I said, well, we're going to do a space bridge, and it's the first space bridge where we can really say anything we want, and they promise me they are not going to edit out any criticism. They won't take out anything they promised me. And the voice of the other end said, they'll rig the interpreters. And I thought, we sent our own people over there to choose the audience, as Vladimir said. So we could, first of all, I'm trying to protect my virginity, whatever was left of it. And we wanted to, we wanted the program to have integrity so that we didn't have a lot of relatives of apparatchiks in the audience. And we had a reasonable cross-section of people here in the States. So off we go to two women who work for me, go to Moscow, and they went into factories. Would you like to be on a space bridge? Da. Niet, whatever they said. And we had a harder time getting into Boeing in Seattle than we did major industrial, large major industrial, heavy industry factories in Leningrad.
Well, we have a second clip, and the second clip is going to feature both of our guests today. It's their kind of summation statements to the show that we just saw. So maybe we can begin with the second clip. We can show that now.
May I ask you, Vladimir, how you feel about what has transpired here?
I have very complex feelings about what happened. I'm very pleased that it's happened. But what happened has indicated, very precisely, I think, how difficult it is for us to talk with each other. I don't want to sound flippant, but in the musical My Fair Lady, there is a refrain when Higgins is amazed at Lisa says, why can't a woman be more like a man?
I hated him.
And he's very concerned about this. I think that sometimes we are demanding, we're asking each other, why aren't we more like each other? Why don't you act the same way as we do? This is not right. And today, I think that if we've at least understood this on both sides, that we are in fact different, that each of us has its own viewpoint, and that it's worth something. This will be a first step, albeit a trembling one, but a first step towards understanding. And when we understand, then we will no longer be afraid of each other. There'll be no paranoia. There'll be normal conversation. First and foremost, we have to understand. This is my feeling about today's meeting.
May I say, Vladimir? May I say, please? We do have prejudices about each other. And it gives me no joy to say that much of the reporting about your country in the West does have a Western spin. We aren't getting as much varied information about you as we should. It should also be said that your media is not famous for featuring American spokesmen, including our president. We also want you to know that we think what you do in your country is your business. But we ask you to believe that millions of Americans see the crushing of solidarity in Poland as an autocratic move against the will of the people. They see the invasion of Afghanistan similarly. The difference is that we argue our foreign policy decisions, and you do not. And we cannot overstate how discouraged Americans are to realize that we have such a powerful, enlightened nation of talented people, numbering over 260 million, who appear to be intimidated by a select few of males who make decisions about where Soviet influence will be felt without any concern about how their own people feel, thereby denying yourself the wisdom of your own populace.
Well, as you see, that was really quite an ending. Both of you had an opportunity to really let go. And Vladimir, I'd like to go to a statement that you said. You said there will be no paranoia. Is there still paranoia in the relationship? Do we really know more about one another now than we did then?
Well, the first thing I want to say about what Phil just, what he said back then, you cannot imagine what that meant to hear that in the Soviet Union in 1985 on Soviet television. Never, ever had anyone said anything remotely like that. And the fact that this got on television was proof positive of the tremendous changes that were occurring in the Soviet Union at that time. I remember when I was listening to him speaking there, I thought, this is the end of my show. We're all going to get sent to Siberia. this is it. It's, you know, we're dead. We are dead. It turned out to be something very wonderful. I just thought that's important. Now, paranoia, no. I don't think there's any paranoia. There is a feeling, at least there was. I should say that prior to President Obama's, his becoming president, there was a feeling that America was throwing its weight around like the 800-pound gorilla, that it was paying no attention to Russia, that Russia was kind of a second-class country, and that no matter what Russia said or asked for, the United States couldn't care less. There was a feeling that NATO was creeping up on Russia. The war in Yugoslavia was something Russia was completely and totally against. And there were not a few people who used that, who played to that, and exploiting the old anti-American fears that existed for so long. Today in Russia, you do have a significant number, I wouldn't say a majority, certainly not, but a number of people who still fear the United States, who still see the United States as the #1 enemy. And polls show this to be true. Now, it's not a majority, it's about 15%, but that's not a small percentage when you think about it. So there's a long way to go before there is any kind of real understanding, a sense of partnership, if you will, a sense of, if you will, understanding what Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in his book about democracy in America, where he pointed out that in his opinion, America and Russia were fated to play a pivotal role in world history together. I think that's still down the road, but I do believe that. And it's going to take a while for both sides, and I'm now talking about average people, to really come to an understanding of what both countries are about. It's going to take a lot of effort.
Thank you. Phil, I was very struck by the point that you made when you said, we think that what you do in your own country is your business. And thinking about U.S.-Russian relations since then, would you still say that today? Has that been a principle underlying the relationship?
Well, you know, I mean, that's not, I said it because I wanted to sort of take a little bit of the edge off my, and remember, I'm doing that because I got to prove this is legit. I know it's a narrow thing, but, you know, I had so many people say, he's a propagandist about Vladimir. Why are you working with him? He's a propagandist. And I can't help but make this point. Every major metropolitan newspaper in America supported the invasion of Iraq. Who's the propagandist here? So you have American reporters looking at Vladimir and saying, propaganda, propaganda, and then taking the handout and reading it on the evening news from the administration. Now, this is a little bit, maybe reducio absurdio, but still, you know, there are a lot of hardworking reporters. I'm not, but you know, we have a press corps that is, in many ways, internalized all the values of the administration. It's, you know, there's so much pressure out there. You don't love America if you criticize it. There are Americans who believe that if a president calls a war, you got to support it. Believe this. And these are good people, church-going, tax-paying. You got to support it. And maybe that's why we're here. But to your question, I don't know. I'm not sure how different it is now, or certainly we're not as interested in Russia now. We don't think of it as the bear, the evil empire. That was drama. There's no drama.
Do you think we should be more interested in Russia?
Sure. I mean, my goodness, 11 time zones. This is a powerful, powerful presence on Earth. We share the neighborhood. And I'll tell you, one of the things that was clear to us with all this experience that I had, so fortunate to have in Russia, you know, that they're people too, and they've got kids, and they're worrying about the same things. I'm not sure there is I'm not sure they're, certainly the populists did not seem to me to be saber rattling. And that was the rap against their leadership.
Vladimir, you not too long ago did a very interesting show of traveling around the United States. I guess you were retracing the path of Ilfin Petrov, Soviet-era satirist who had made a trip and wrote a book called One Story America. I'm just curious, did you sense did you feel a sense of indifference among Americans towards Russia? Has American attitudes changed in any way? Was there anything that surprised you? Did you feel that you were being treated differently now than you would have during the Cold War, and if so, how?
Well, the first time I was allowed to get out of the Soviet Union and go to the United States, I think was in 1986 or 87, something like that. Incidentally, I went straight on the Donahue show. But I was followed by the FBI. I know that. I was later told that I was followed by the FBI and so on. Those things have changed, obviously. But I would also make a point that, it's so difficult to compare what was happening then and what's happening now. There's profound change. In this trip that we made, we produced a 16-episode documentary on the United States. And we traveled all over the place. And here we are in a little town called Miami, Oklahoma. And believe me, it's not Miami, Florida. I mean, you just trust me, okay? And we drive up to a gas station. And so we have our equipment and everything. We have cameras on our cars because we're filming from the car and inside the car and so on. And this truck drives up with about 6 young men, 18 to 22, who are roofers. They make roofs, they build roofs. And they see this and they say, wow, hey, television, are we going to get to see ourselves? And we say, no, sorry, but we're going to show this in Moscow, Russia, in Miami, Oklahoma. And they say, oh, okay. No interest. You know, Moscow, Russia, the fact that we're in Miami, Oklahoma, absolutely no interest whatsoever. Very nice kids. As a matter of fact, one of the questions that I asked throughout the trip when I was interviewing people, the last question I would ask was, please complete this sentence for me. To me, being an American means, and so I asked this 20 years old, and said, well, would you complete this for me? To me, being an American means, and he thinks for a minute, he says, well, it means it's better than being a Mexican. And, but I must say that people talked to us. They were extremely open.
World War III, Vladimir.
Especially if I said that in California, probably. But
or
anyway,
Arizona.
Or Arizona, right.
Yeah. But I have to say that we had no problems. We got to see everything we wanted. I was able to go to several prisons, interview someone who was on death row. The only time we had any problem was in Norfolk, Virginia, where we were doing a story on the U.S. military. And basically, we were not allowed to interview the sailors. That is to say, we couldn't ask political questions, and we got kicked off the ship for asking them. But that was the only unpleasant moment. Otherwise, I have to say that the openness was tremendous. The access was great. And there was not a whole lot of interest in us, in where we were coming from, about Russia. Very few people asked any questions about Russia. It was quite, I mean, for me, it was something I was expecting. But for the whole crew, who were true blue Russians and who'd never been to the United States, they couldn't understand. Why aren't they asking us anything? And, they say, well, they're just not interested, which is true.
Yeah. Okay. Tell them how much mail you got, Vlad, after this first Spacebridge.
Oh, after this first Spacebridge, the Seattle-Leningrad Spacebridge, I got 77,000 letters. Can you believe this? And there were two main points in those letters. One was, Comrade Posner, could you tell me where you got those jerks who were in the studio with you? Now, if you'd invited people like myself, we would have a different audience. And the second thought, which I thought was very important, was We saw our face in the mirror, and we didn't like it. And in that sense, the impact of seeing Americans saying what they wanted, really not being afraid to talk, being very outspoken, that was something that impressed the Soviet side, because the Soviets knew darn well that the people in the audience were being very careful about what they were saying and would not say anything critical about their own country at all. And that was, in my opinion, a very, very strong, influential kind of result.
Okay, I think we'll go to the floor for 15 minutes, 20 minutes of questions, focusing on the period of the Cold War. We're going to talk about the contemporary period in more detail in a little bit. So let me see if there are any questions from the floor. David Hoffman? We have a microphone.
I just wonder if both of you could put us in the context of the arrival of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev in that period. You remember, Vladimir, the famous walk on the street in Leningrad that Gorbachev made. What was going on in these months? How did Glasnost, what was the context of Glasnost with the Spacebridge?
Well, in my opinion, the Spacebridge itself was probably the first clear evidence that Glasnost was happening. The fact that this got on the air in itself happened only because of Gorbachev and Alexander Yakovlev, who was instrumental in making Glasnost happen. We did not go live with Phil because there was an 11-hour difference between Leningrad and Seattle, so we couldn't go live. But we didn't go live in addition to that because Phil had to cut his show to fit his own Donahue show. It had to be something like 44 minutes. And we cut ours to an hour and 15 minutes, so it was not the same show. So once it was edited, I didn't know this, but it was sent to Gorbachev. And Gorbachev and Yakovlev watched it, and they called the head of what was then called Gosteleradio, which is to say state television, the only television that existed in those days in the Soviet Union, saying, this is what we want. We had no idea that this was happening. So the show itself, I mean, the Spacebridge turned out to be an instrument in what Gorbachev and Yakovlev were trying to do when they spoke about Glasnost, about openness, which is how you translate that word. Probably, I mean, you know, since I participated in this, maybe I should be more careful. I think that it was one of the most important things, one of the most important events in shaping Glasnost in the Soviet Union. And certainly Gorbachev was instrumental in making it happen.
Phil, how did you feel about the impact of these shows right after?
Well, we were very disappointed. The response in the States was tepid. The Donahue show was on over probably 220, 25 stations. I don't think we got 100 stations to carry this. I'm not sure. We should check that. I should know. But it was more evidence that they were more interested in us than we were in them. And I began to realize that the vision of the American populace, certainly at that time, we talk about today, does not extend really beyond our shores. Unless it's the evil empire or the axis of evil, we care about Iran. We care about people who are going to drop a bomb on our neighborhood. But we do not appear to have a whole lot of global vision here. We're very parochial people, and it's hurting us. And it was very apparent when I went over there and saw, you know, I mean, I felt like a walking encyclopedia. They want simple questions. And it all was about America. Fascinating, fascinating.
Okay, well, this gentleman down here, and please identify yourself. We're getting a microphone.
David Dudman. I was wondering, in the late 50s, I remember reading a book called Inside Russia by John Gunther, who was a prominent journalist, and he interviewed Khrushchev. And about a little bit thereafter, of course, the famous kitchen debate with Nixon and Khrushchev. But I don't remember anything comparable to that in the intervening years before the Spacebridge. I was wondering if there's any other kinds of sort of opening of the window onto Russia from American.
Yeah. Vlad?
Not that well, of course, John Gunther wrote a whole series of books, as you know, the first one being Inside USA, which was a really wonderful book. That was back, I think, in 1948 or so. And he wrote Inside Latin America, and he also wrote Inside the Soviet Union. But there were many books that were written. If you talk about the kind of thing like the kitchen debate, which happened at the US National Expo in Moscow, that was a very rare occasion, very rare. It got a lot of air in Russia, but of course showing Khrushchev demolishing Nixon. And of course what you saw in America was the opposite. You saw Nixon demolishing Khrushchev, which is on par with what media do very often. But anyway, I don't think there was anything like the space bridges before nor after. It's pretty unique. The reason the space bridge happened was because of people in the United States and in the Soviet Union who were really worried about what was going to happen. Don't forget that this was during the Reagan years. So the ash heap of history, the evil empire, all of that. There were no exchanges. All exchanges had been curtailed. And there was a real danger of conflict. And so there were people, just very average people, who were extremely upset and trying to figure out how do we get to talk to each other? Nobody's talking anymore. And there was this man who, in my opinion, was a visionary. He's passed away since then. His name was Joseph Golden. He lived in Moscow.
Joseph what?
He said Golden, G-O-L-D-E-N.
Golden, yes.
Yes, and he said, you know, why don't we use big screens and have Americans and Russians talk to each other directly? Why don't we do that? And the American side just latched onto that, and so did the Soviets. So this was a result of real concern about where we were going, what was happening. And I don't think you get this kind of activity unless there's a real reason for it. Today things are a lot easier. I mean, the Russian leadership does not at all think that the United States is going to attack it, and vice versa. There are relations. We've just signed this very important treaty, the START II treaty, and so on. So there's not this this need, it would seem, to talk to each other. Although on the other hand, I do think it's important, and what I really regret is the visa problem. It is very difficult for Russians to get U.S. visas to visit the United States. I would hope that, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of Russia, especially younger Russians, could come to America and just, you know, be there and talk to people and have it, you know, a two-way street. I don't think that maybe a space bridge now could play the same role.
Okay. I see there are three more questions we're going to take. And we'll start with Thomas. We'll go then to the woman behind and the gentleman in the middle, and then we're going to have to switch gears.
And the young woman up here.
We'll try to squeeze her in too. Okay.
My name's Thomas Grindley. Armand Hammer and Cyrus Eaton used to be very prominent in citizen diplomacy. Could you place them in context and explain what they did for Russian-American relations?
You heard that, Vlad?
Yes, I did. Well, I think there's a big difference between the two. Cyrus Eaton, who was an extremely wealthy man, and whose activities happened a little bit afterwards, he was someone who felt that it was very important that Soviet and U.S. relations be normalized. He traveled many times to the Soviet Union. Because of his stature, and because of his wealth, and because of his contacts, he could speak to people at the very highest level, both in the United States and in the Soviet Union. And I think that played a role. It wasn't citizen diplomacy in the sense of kind of an organized group or organized groups of people. It was rather one man having this vision and following it. And that's very different from Armand Hammer. Armand Hammer, early on, saw that he could make a lot of money in the Soviet Union. First time he came to the Soviet Union, Lenin was still the leader of the country. Lenin died in 1924. Arm & Hammer, as a very young man, came to the Soviet Union, and thanks to the kind of contacts, economic contacts that he established, he became extremely wealthy. And again, as someone who had the power and the contacts and the money, he organized a great many exchanges between the countries. In that sense, he was important. But I don't think that he or Cyrus Vance were able to, Eaton, were able to really affect policy changes. It doesn't seem, as far as I know, they were really not able to change the animosity and the view that both countries had of each other as being the enemy and the one that would probably attack.
Okay, there was a question right behind, right?
Mary Dominic, this question is for Mr. Posner. George Ball, who was an Undersecretary of State, said that the Helsinki Accords human rights provisions were an innocuous sweetener for the West. And that agreement was signed by Gerald Ford, not Jimmy Carter, as most of us may remember. I wondered if you could talk about the role of the Helsinki Accords and the free flow of information in setting the stage for your television interchange, and if you could comment on what role it has played since then.
Well, maybe I'm saying something that's not very kosher, if you will, but in my opinion, the Helsinki Accords played no role whatsoever in improving the human rights situation in the Soviet Union. Things were bad, and they stayed bad throughout the period of Brezhnev and throughout the Andropov period and so on. The only reason for the changes that occurred in the Soviet Union was, the election by the Politburo, a very small elite group, as you know, of Mikhail Gorbachev. According to the information I have, there were several people who wanted to become General Secretary. One of them was a man by the name of Mr. Grishin. And in the final vote, Gorbachev won by 1 vote. And my feeling is that if Grishin had become General Secretary, we wouldn't be talking to each other today. In fact, I'm almost certain there would have been a war. It was that close. And the Helsinki Accords, while politically important in the sense of creating a certain kind of atmosphere, in reality, changed nothing at all in the Soviet Union. I think it was a great propaganda coup for the Soviet Union to have those accords signed in Helsinki. They really did not improve the situation with human rights in Russia and the Soviet Union at all.
Okay. The gentleman right in the middle, and then we'll come up here and switch gears.
Mitchell Pullman. This is just sort of a follow-up to the question that was asked before. I think when you're talking about books during this time period, you have to talk about Hedrick Smith's book, The Russians, which was a New York Times bestseller, and which I had assigned to me 3 times, once in high school and twice in college, and did quite a bit to bring the Russian people home to the American people, that is, to explain the Russian people. But I would point out he was able to do so because, as a correspondent, he was able to live in the Soviet Union for a long period of time, which was something that very few Americans were able to do. And, it would have been difficult, I think, to have been in Mr. Donahue's audience and know what kind of questions to ask when we, too, could not travel that easily to the Soviet Union and travel around and gather information. Americans just simply didn't know very much at the time about Russia to be able to know what to ask.
That is true.
Mm-hmm. And Bob Kaiser's book as well, which was at the same time.
Vlad?
I'd just like to say that many Americans were simply fearful of traveling to the Soviet Union. It was a scary country as far as they were concerned, and there weren't that many people who even wanted to go. As for Hedrick Smith, that book, The Russians, in my opinion, is probably one of the 3 best books ever written about modern Russia. Hedrick, who I know quite well and who I consider to be a friend, when he was a bureau chief for the New York Times, first of all, he learned Russian. And most American correspondents didn't speak a word of Russian. So, they communicated through their translators and through their interpreters. He learned Russian. He went to bathhouses. Russians love to go to bathhouses. It's a very popular kind of thing. And you know, when he said, when you're naked there, with everybody else, who knows who we are? You're American or what? He spoke with an accent. He could have been Lithuanian or whatever. So, you know, people talked, and he talked to them. And he wrote this wonderful book, in my opinion, really a great book. And if you do read it, it does give you insight. And it was a bestseller. But you know, what is a bestseller in the United States? How many copies? You know, even it's 1 million copies, which is a hell of a bestseller. How many people actually get to read the book? So, you know, although it's a great book, and I have 2 copies of it, which I keep, the first one that came out and one that Hedrick gave me not long ago when I was in the United States, it's still a very limited audience, with all due respect.
And the final question right now.
Ina Dubinsky, I have a question to you, Mr. Donahue, and you, Mr. Posner. Why did your space show or Spacebridge have such a short lifespan?
I better. Well, I told you about the less than enthusiastic response of the American television industry. You know, the size of the audience is the coin of the realm in commercial television. And it's hard to waterboard a general manager for not wanting to air a program that's not going to draw a crowd. And, you know, we didn't. These shows didn't burn the town down, ratings-wise. So that may explain why. We did 2. We did Seattle, Leningrad, and then Boston, Leningrad, women to women, women only. Can we see what's in your purse? Halfway around the world. People opened up. So I think it was it's the chill here, you know. This is MTV culture here. And talking heads, no desk, no couch, no band, no laughs. You know, that's a tough sell. But you know, it killed us because we knew what a noble purpose this was. And as Saul Hurok, the great impresario, said, if they won't come, you can't make them. And we did the best we could. We had a lot of progressive thinking general managers who grabbed this and tried to promote it. So, you know, they weren't all tone deaf. A lot of them are very good. But they have to think about their number on the page from the Nielsen rating service.
Okay. And I only
I better. Well, I told you about the less than enthusiastic response of the American television industry. You know, the size of the audience is the coin of the realm in commercial television. And it's hard to waterboard a general manager for not wanting to air a program that's not going to draw a crowd. And, you know, we didn't. These shows didn't burn the town down, ratings-wise. So that may explain why. We did 2. We did Seattle, Leningrad, and then Boston, Leningrad, women to women, women only. Can we see what's in your purse? Halfway around the world. People opened up. So I think it was it's the chill here, you know. This is MTV culture here. And talking heads, no desk, no couch, no band, no laughs. You know, that's a tough sell. But you know, it killed us because we knew what a noble purpose this was. And as Saul Hurok, the great impresario, said, if they won't come, you can't make them. And we did the best we could. We had a lot of progressive thinking general managers who grabbed this and tried to promote it. So, you know, they weren't all tone deaf. A lot of them are very good. But but they have to think about their number on the page from the Nielsen rating service.
And I'd only add to that there were no ratings in the Soviet Union. Obviously, you had one network, and that was it. So everybody watched, great ratings, believe me. But once the country, exactly. But once the country changed, and television became privatized, and ratings became, king. Do you get enough people watching? How's advertising doing? You pretty much began to get the same reaction as you do in the United States. It's the same thing. And it's very hard to convince the management of any television network here that a Spacebridge with the United States is going to have a large audience. And one thing that you might find interesting, during the Women to Women Spacebridge, there was a lady in Boston of a certain age who said to the Soviet women, she said, I have a grandson, and he watches television for hours. And there's so much violence on our television, and so much sex. What do you do about this? And so this Soviet, very pretty blonde lady says, we have no sex. And everybody started laughing, uproar, and they didn't hear the end of the sentence, which was, on television. So these words, we have no sex, have become a classic in this country. Everybody says, oh, but we have no sex. And the poor woman has not lived this down to this day, and I think she's emigrated to Germany because she just couldn't stand it anymore.
Well, this is the power of television. We're now going to invite David and Heather to join us, so we're going to rearrange the furniture just a little bit. Please bear with us while we make the changes.
Okay.
And we want to move on and look at the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then we'll end up with a clip from just a couple of weeks ago of news reportage on Russian TV and American TV and talk about the contemporary period. But there is a very interesting transition between this period when everything came down to arms control and what begins to happen in the 1990s when a different agenda emerges. Democratization comes on the agenda, democratization Russia, not the United States. There's a whole economic dimension. Energy emerges as critical. I think it's interesting to reflect on what was the legacy of the period we were talking about for what came after. And I know, David, you've written a little bit about this in your book about the importance of, I think you called it the dead weight of the arms legacy. And Heather, you were a kind of participant in some of this. So David, let me start. How much of this agenda, what kind of shadow did the agenda of the 80s cast as we move forward?
It's a very, very difficult and complex question, Blair, because so many things came rushing upon us all at once. Right after the coup, the attempted coup in August of 1991, President George H.W. Bush was at Walker's Point in Kennebunkport. He held a press conference on September 2nd, and on that day he was asked, what are you going to do to help the Soviet Union in these straits? And he said, I am not going to cut into the muscle of our country to help the Soviet Union. And this idea that somehow we were still adversaries at that point when really the Soviet Union was tottering was held very widely. And at the time, Ash Carter, a professor from Harvard, was arguing for what later became the Nunn-Lugar legislation. He went to the Pentagon. He met with a high-level Pentagon official. He said, here's what we have in mind. We have to help them. There's 60,000 weapons, chaos and uncertainty. And a top Pentagon official said, no. He said, his position was very clear that we had spent 50 years trying to impoverish these people. We'd finally done it. And at this moment, you want to help them? This Pentagon official said he had one idea. He wanted them in free fall. Free fall. And at home, that autumn, we tend to forget, but Americans were turning inward, and the mood was one of certainly exhilaration and relief, but also, you recall there was a election in Pennsylvania that fall, and the Republican who ran for the Senate ran on a slogan, "It's time to take care of our own people." So the first thing that we have to know is that the immediate reaction to these historic events, the collapse of the Soviet Union, was one in which Americans were certainly very, very happy to see the stress and the burden of the Cold War over, and it was an extraordinary moment, but also, secondly, a little bit of incomprehension about what would follow, what it would mean, and what we would be called upon to do. Secondly, some pretty amazing things happened that are counterintuitive right in those months and in that first year. The first was that in the period after the coup and before the actual collapse of the Soviet Union in December, the two leaders, President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, both made probably the most impromptu and wide-ranging arms control non-agreement in the history of the Cold War. These were called the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives, and first Bush and then Gorbachev pulled back a large amount of the small and dangerous tactical nuclear weapons on each side. And we tend again to forget how remarkable this was. The historian Ray Gartoff has called it arms control in reverse and downhill. And these initiatives, both in September and October, were not something that people were advocating. There were not peace marches in the street. People obviously were a little uncertain about it, but when Gorbachev did this, one thing that we didn't know, but which was true at the time, is that the Soviet system had never built a reverse gear for the arms race. And as these weapons began to come back from the periphery, actually they were all being brought back to the Russian Republic out of places like Belarus and Ukraine, and some of them had been even brought earlier back from the GDR and other places. They were being carried in trains, literally strapped down into cargo boxes in trains without any special reinforcement. And these rickety trains were oftentimes so full, and the warehouses to put some of these weapons in so crowded, that the Russian and Soviet officials who came to Washington to tell us about this said, the trains have stopped on their tracks, dead in their tracks. They can't move. We don't know. We have never planned to have this. So it's quite remarkable. And the third point I'd like to make about this is that despite the isolation at home and the somewhat hidden crisis of these presidential nuclear initiatives, especially in the case of the Soviet Union, there was a moment of incredible vision and farsightedness in the United States, and again, counterintuitive. But Senator Sam Nunn had been on the streets of Moscow in the days after the coup. And at one point, because he was a senator and leader of the Armed Services Committee, he was invited to visit with Gorbachev. And I remind you, this is only days after Gorbachev had returned from Foros. They had a rather perfunctory discussion. In the end of it, as he was leaving, Nunn turned to Gorbachev and said, Mikhail Sergeyevich, tell me, did you lose control of the nuclear weapons? Gorbachev would not answer the question. When Nunn got home, having seen the chaos on the streets and having had this exchange with Gorbachev, he led a very, very far-sighted effort to do something about this legacy issue, the large number of nuclear weapons, the amount of uncertainty and chaos at the time. And we also forget that the American public was not clamoring for their Congress to act. Nunn brought his legislation with Congressman Aspen to the Senate floor, and it was essentially collapsed for lack of support. At the time, senators told Nunn, how can I vote for something like this if you can't give me at least a 30-second soundbite of why I should do this? So I think that this Nunn-Lugar legislation was extremely important in sort of setting the tone of the early period, but there was nonetheless a lot of mistrust and suspicion that characterized it. And, you know, it's interesting to me that through the whole 2 decades since, despite the ups and downs of our relationship with Russia, and despite its ups and downs and its struggle with both democracy and markets, the Nunn-Lugar program remained steadfast, did a lot of important things, and was really probably, I think, the most important constructive legacy of that very early period. There were some others. Lastly, I think that in the euphoria of this particular time, both Russian and American audiences missed something. We failed to really grasp the meaning of what had happened with the Soviet collapse. And, you know, on the biggest fault, I think, lay on the American side, because we, maybe very naturally, but incorrectly, assumed that we had won something, that there was a triumph here, and that we could basically forget about it. And this triumphalism clouded our understanding of what was about to happen in Russia in the years afterwards. And I think I would refer you to Jack Matlock's new book, which I think takes this on very nicely. And, you know, my own experience as a journalist in this period is that there was a kind of grand bargain that was posited to the Russians, and the bargain was this: if they tried the markets that we were setting up for them, if they listened to what we had to say about democracy, although we didn't always prescribe it as fully as we should have, certainly the electoral democracy part, that living standards would improve, that there would be some trade-off. You know, you may recall that in his famous speech in October of 1991, when, you know, Yeltsin promised people he was going to lift free prices and property and trade in January, and people tried to get him not to promise things will get better in 6 months, and he went ahead and made the promise. Inevitably, disappointment and bitterness set in, and it set in not only with Yeltsin, who as the head of state, but it set in with us, and it set in essentially with the American prescription. And part of our mistake was certainly the quick fix ideas that came with shock therapy. I was and remain a believer that it was the only approach to do it that way, but we forgot about the culture. And I think, I mean, especially the political culture. We forgot to factor in the time it would take to bring some of these through. And I think in retrospect, that was a big misunderstanding on our side, and in some ways led to the rise of what we now, of Putinism that we now see. Because I think this discouragement led a lot of credence to what Putin now tells people, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was an error, that the West was out only to destroy us and to exploit us. And I would just quote Michael Mandelbaum writing in Foreign Affairs this month. He said, "The triumphalist interpretation has had pernicious consequences. It reinforced Putin's narrative of his country's recent history, which asserts that the end of the Soviet Union was an unmitigated disaster, foisted on the Russians by the West in order to weaken the Russian nation." So we made some errors of perception, errors of action, even though I think the overall direction and large choices were right. That's what I...
Vladimir, I'm interested in your reaction to that. And as I think back about, Moscow in December of 1991, January 1992, as prices were being freed, it was pretty chaotic. And people, there was an air of desperation in some of those lines around Moscow and elsewhere in the country. And it would seem that the arms control agenda was pretty far removed from how Russians were thinking at the time. When you hear David talk about that period, what comes to your mind?
Well, let's keep in mind that shortly after the lid was taken off prices, inflation reached 2,600%. 2,600. The money that had been set aside by people for a rainy day, by older people for when they would die and get a proper burial, was turned to dust. Whatever there was in the stores, and there wasn't a whole lot in those days, they couldn't buy anything. And this was democracy? This was what the West had promised? Most Russians felt that the West should embraced them. They had thrown off the communist yoke. It wasn't Reagan who did this. It was we, as they would say. We did it. And what do we get as a result? We get this horrible life, which is much worse than in the communist years. At least then, we had guaranteed jobs, we had a guaranteed roof over our head, not big apartments to be sure, but nonetheless, free medical care. Now we have nothing. So the reaction, which, you know, in the Gorbachev years was a very positive one, yes, finally, suddenly became very, very negative, very negative. The reason for Putin's success, and mind you, Putin came to power in the year 2000, a bit later, but the reason for it was that Russians had this sense of being downtrodden, disrespected, nobody cared for them, nobody listened to their voice, and here was a guy who came and said, okay, enough. We are a strong, proud nation, and we are going to get back on our feet, and we are not going to bow before and scrape before the West and what have you. And when Putin said that the demise, if you will, of the Soviet Union was a tragedy, it was for a great many people. Now, the way his words have been used, of course, in my opinion, has been distorted. He's really, again, I've spoken to him about this, so I think I know what he's talking about. What he's saying is that for millions and millions of people, the demise of the Soviet Union was a personal tragedy. And there are still not a few people in Russia who think with nostalgia about the old times, especially older people who cannot cope with what's happening now, who don't have the money, who can't handle the new system, which is called the market. So for them, and there are not a few of them, it is a tragedy. And here's this strong man who comes around and he says the world is going to respect us, and it has to, because Russia is now this power with all this energy and this oil and its gas and what have you, and you cannot, as was the case under Yeltsin, just tell the Russians go to hell. It doesn't work anymore. And the Russians are a very proud people. I think the United States, the policymakers, made a great mistake when they didn't seize the moment. In my opinion, what they should have done was to devise a kind of a Marshall Plan, very carefully, focusing money in certain areas instead of saying, you know, go do it yourself. The Marshall Plan that worked so well for Western Europe. I think had that view prevailed, Russia today would be a very different country. But it didn't prevail. So much of what has been said by David Hoffman is absolutely true. The picture is a true one. Although, you know, I would differ on some parts of that.
Heather, I'm going to get to you in a second, but I want to ask Phil Donahue, when you reflect back on that remarkable period when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you were just coming out of this period where you had this really remarkable achievement. How were you thinking about what was unfolding?
You know, I think I was rose-colored glasses. Oh, the wall is down in Berlin, and the world is going to open, and we're all going to be able to reach out and shake hands with Russians, just as I did. And they're going to find out, as I did, that they don't have horns. You know, they're proud people. And they want to know us. They're curious about us. So I'm afraid that some of that, when they were no longer the evil empire, and we no longer had Ronald Reagan making that point, we lost the drama. And without the drama, the audience diminishes. That's why the talking heads on the shout shows are now fighting with each other. Because they know that that will draw a crowd, and it has. You know, all drama has to have, you know, like a sentence, a subject, a predicate. And when we lost the Russian bear, I'm afraid we lost our interest in. This is very, very rough-hewn observation, but generally speaking, I believe that's true.
Now, Heather, if we move a little bit further into the 90s, and then this is a period in which you were very much involved in what was going on sort of in the U.S. policy circles. what kinds of options do you think were realistically on the table at that time? What were the decision points that were made or not made?
Well, I think it's interesting to start actually back in the earlier period and think about who the players were and realize how profoundly both the period of the space bridges and the period before that had shaped who the decision makers were. My first day in Vienna working at what's now the OSCE was also the first ever NATO Warsaw Pact military doctrine seminar in January 1990. The Soviet delegation was led by a senior military official. The US delegation was led by Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, both of whom had significant background in US-Soviet affairs. A generation of folks younger than them, my age, who had come to Soviet studies in the 80s by seeing the space bridges, like me and the gentleman who asked the question being assigned Rick Smith's book in high school and deciding that that was what we wanted to do with our lives. So you had a whole generation of people in low to senior positions whose whole view of the world was shaped by the US-Soviet conflict, and in many ways that was a view that proved inadequate to a world where we needed to be able to look at the Soviet Union and then Russia quite differently. So I think to move ahead, and I see Wayne Mary, who was around then too, shaking his head in the audience. If we sort of skip ahead then to the post-coup period and then looking on after that, you had, as David noted, the domestic pressures at home. You also had, if you remember, significant international economic pressures. This was the period where we were taking sledgehammers to Japanese cars, which also made it very difficult for American political leaders to think about the kind of Marshall Plan model that was suggested at the time. And I think you also had, to the sort of American non-expert audience, the fact that this appeared to come out of nowhere, that nobody was predicting there was any problem with the Soviet Union, and then suddenly, poof, from the layperson's perspective, it appeared to fall apart. And so really, since it had fallen apart apparently by itself just through the magic of Ronald Reagan, why did we need to do anything? And there was never a really deep understanding, I think, even in the political classes, of why there might need to be some investment in what appeared to be, you know, Phil's prayers at the altar coming true after all these years. So you get to the mid-90s and you have international economic pressures, you have domestic pressures, you have a presidential election in 1992 with a third-party candidate where, if you remember, President Bush comes under significant pressure for what I remember as the Chicken Kiev speech in late 1991, where he encouraged the people of Ukraine not to vote to secede from the Soviet Union, which interestingly probably took a great number of the ethnic communities in the US that were historically Democratic, had been trending Republican, pushed them back into the Democratic fold as Bush appeared not to understand the historic national aspirations of the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Balts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, you have Yugoslavia, which produces you know, a policy mess. It's clear to everyone that we don't have the tools to deal with this new era that's suddenly been unleashed upon us. You also have Nagorno-Karabakh, a number of other conflicts or potential conflicts around the edges of the former Soviet Union, and a real repugnance and a desire not to get mixed up in all of this, combined with, again, because of who your leadership is on both sides and who your journalists and commentators are and what their formative experiences were, the perception that, well, this may not be the Soviet Union anymore, but it's still the Soviet mentality. And so I think very quickly, by the time you get to 94, and in 94, of course, you have Gingrich and the midterm elections, and the rise of this language about foreign aid being money poured down rat holes and so on. So the window in the American context is really only open, say, 90 to 92. I mean, the window turned out to be, I think, a lot smaller than many of us at the time thought that it would be.
But looking at it the other way, no one's mentioned NATO expansion, which I suspect if we were having this discussion in Moscow might have come up before now. And I'm wondering, we're talking about citizen diplomacy and we're talking about interaction. Vladimir, do you think if NATO expansion was going to happen, some of the mechanisms that discussions like this could have made a difference? Could the American side, could the Western side have presented NATO expansion in a way that was less threatening to Russia, or is it important, unimportant? If it was inevitable, was the Russian response to it inevitable? And how much of a role is that in this story?
Well, you know, I think quite an important role. I've spoken to Mr. Gorbachev about this several times. We have an old and pretty friendly relationship. And I asked him, I said, you know, what about this NATO expansion thing? Were there any guarantees given to you that there would be no expansion? He said, look, Secretary of State in those days, I think it was Baker, said to me, NATO will not expand by 1 inch. But, says Gorbachev, how could NATO expand by 1 inch? All the countries to where it has expanded in those days when we were talking were part of the so-called socialist bloc countries. So the only expansion could be a military, I mean a war, right? When the Soviet Union fell apart, when the former Soviet bloc countries became independent, the situation changed. And the NATO side, led by the United States, said, well, the promise was made to the Soviet Union. There is no more Soviet Union. So the promise is not valid anymore. And therefore, NATO expands. Now this was seen, and is seen today, I would say, by not a few Russians, including those in pretty high places, as a play on words. You promised not to expand from where you were. It doesn't matter, Soviet Union, not Soviet Union. But in fact, you've taken advantage of the fact that there is no more Soviet Union, and you've used this to come right up to our borders. Now you can tell the Russian leadership and the average Russian guy in the street, NATO is not an aggressive bloc. It's on the contrary. It's a defensive bloc. That it just doesn't. People don't believe that. They say, well, if it's such a, what is it? It's defensive. What are you defending? Against whom are you defending? Why is Poland and why are the Balts and so on so anxious to be part of NATO, have become part of NATO? Against whom is your defense? Against us? Well, then say so. Say that NATO is here to protect all of these countries from Russia. Tell that to us, and we'll react. But you're saying, we're only there to defend, and we don't know who you're defending against. I'm giving you the kind of man in the street, and not only man in the street reaction to this growth of NATO. So it is a thorn in the side of the relationship. And I don't know, you know, hopefully there are people today in Russia, including leadership people, who are thinking seriously about, is there a possibility for Russia to become part of NATO? And I repeat, they're thinking about this seriously. Now, were that to happen, and it's not going to happen tomorrow, that would significantly change the whole equation.
Heather, do you think there could have been different paths forward from this period?
Yeah, so there are two decision points on that that are really interesting. And one, of course, is the reunification of Germany and the negotiations over what would happen to Germany's role in NATO, because, of course, that was the moment where, as Vladimir said, suddenly there was some territory that had previously been part of the Warsaw Pact. And as the final negotiations were worked out, Germany remained in NATO. The interesting thing is, at that period, the Europeans were quite focused on the idea of not expanding NATO, indeed of getting rid of NATO when you got rid of the Warsaw Pact. And there was this fascinating moment in, again, 90, 91, 92, although it had fallen away pretty significantly by 92, in part because of the Yugoslav wars, where there was a strenuous continental European interest in getting rid of NATO. And I think the US, you know, that was never more than a fringe interest here for sort of obvious geostrategic reasons. But I think then compounded after 92 by the political problem of having a Democratic president who's perceived as weak on national security, doesn't want to be perceived as soft, and again perceives that he owes a considerable political debt to the white ethnic Democrats who do, and then this I think traces back to something else, Vladimir, that you said, that the Poles and later the Balts and the Czechs and the Hungarians all want to join NATO. And it turns out that especially once the first wave of post-dissident governments are gone, They want to join NATO. They don't want to become some part of some interim in-between space, and they use every tool they have, which includes their diasporas in the US, to advocate for that very, very strongly. So the way that it could have been different, I think, is if you had moved very quickly in the very early period, by 93, 94, 95, when the Clinton administration was considering NATO enlargement, it was too late, because what were you going to say to the Poles and the Czechs? If you had in 90, 91 already really taken up the notion of there being some other kind of structure that you could have put in place, I think that's the moment that there could have been a different outcome. But by the time NATO enlargement had officially made its way onto the agenda, it was too late. And given that, and given the other points that that Vladimir has made about what happened within Russia, I don't think, and Vladimir, I tell me if I'm wrong, I don't see that there's any way you could have done NATO enlargement that would have been less painful than it was. I mean, it was what it was, and I don't know how else you could have sugarcoated it.
I don't think you could have either. It was either a question of disbanding NATO, which would have been a response to the disbanding of the Warsaw Pact, or you enlarge, and then you enlarge. There's no way to sugarcoat that. I totally agree.
David, how much of this was sort of driven by the imperative of the weapons that existed? I mean, you've written about the impact on developments of coming out of this period with huge arsenals of weapons. What?
You know, it's interesting, the mechanism of arms control, which was so much in the headlines in the news in the 70s and the 80s, diminished somewhat. I think partly neglect on both sides, but the great arms control force of the 90s was economics. And in fact, we sat and watched very clearly as the former Soviet nuclear strategic deterrent began to rust, and the long life expectancies of those missiles began to expire, and they began to come off of combat duty. And certainly at the Helsinki summit that took place partway through that decade, new numbers were coming up. They were going down, 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 and there was really, nobody was negotiating like had happened earlier. It was atrophy was really. So the weapons themselves were following the trend. But I'd like to add something about this period, which I think we tend to forget, but it was certainly very vivid in my memory, which is that this economic turmoil that Vladimir talked about was a paramount factor in almost everything that occurred in Russia in the 90s. And I think obviously the 96 election, we did talk often, and as a journalist write often about democracy, but most of all, we were confronting a country that was still not very sure-footed about what would happen to it and what kind of identity it would have. Not only people losing their savings in the hyperinflation, but even as the country began to recover and saw really bouts of both prosperity and bust in the 1990s, there was a real sense of humiliation and uncertainty that infused everything. And I remember very clearly on the night that it was nighttime in Moscow when NATO expansion was finally approved, and my editors were just pounding on me to get lots of reaction from various people in Moscow, and Moscow was very, very quiet. It was a humiliating moment. Nobody trotted out in front of the cameras to say anything, not Boris Yeltsin, not anybody else, because what could they say? And I think too often, again, as much as I support most of the market and democracy prescriptions of the era, too often we didn't pay attention to the impact of these, to the central underwriting idea of humiliation. And of course, you have to remember, Yeltsin was often struggling with a country with huge natural resources that were selling at a bargain. And I think that if Boris Yeltsin had, in the mid-90s, experienced $100 a barrel oil, the course of history might have been different. But it's not what happened.
We're going to jump ahead to the contemporary period in a moment, but let me see if there are some questions from the floor about this period of the 1990s. Right down here, Raisa, we're getting your microphone. Please identify yourself.
Thank Thank you. My name is Raisa Skriabin, and in the 90s I was involved in some of the USAID programs in Russia. And I wanted to ask two questions. One is, since the U.S. Agency for International Development is largely involved in programs in developing countries, how was the fact that it was now supporting programs in Russia perceived on the Russian side? And then, from your all experience to all members of the panel, have the U.S. aid programs in areas like health, rule of law, support of the independent media, and economic reform had any appreciable or lasting impact? Thank you.
Vladimir, maybe we'll ask you to start us off with talking about perceptions in Russia.
Well, the perception was very quickly that the United States did not really want to help at all. And on the contrary, a lot of people were applauding the fact that things were so bad in Russia, and that the worse they were, the better it was. And so the idea that USAID, which is a government institution, would be there to help was kind of looked at with a sneer. You know, we know how they want to help us, you can just bet on that. And that reaction is still very much alive today. I don't really think, again, when you talk about supportive independent press, independent is understood as being critical of the Russian government, of things like that. So immediately, well, of course, what they want to do is undermine the stability that we have, and we don't have a whole lot of it. They want to make things difficult for us. So that reaction, which is very much a carryover of the general attitude towards the United States, was very much in evidence there. And I have to say, is still pretty much in evidence. If you're going to say, well, you know, the United States would like to help this and this, out of 100 people, if you get one who's going to look at you seriously, you're pretty lucky.
Heather and David, do you see any lasting impact from the big assistance effort?
You know, I almost see bigger impacts on how it affected our bureaucracy and the way we do business than on Russia, which is a terrible thing to say. And I think many of those impacts were quite pernicious because we then retooled our whole bureaucracy in the 90s as if Russia, the former Soviet states, and the nearby countries were our primary clients, and the folks who work primarily in the developing world were, of course, very unhappy with that. And it also left us with a set of assumptions which, ironically, didn't work particularly well in the Russian and post-Soviet space, but also left us extremely ill-prepared for some of the things that we've taken on in the Arab world in the 2000s. So in retrospect, I think one of the real tragedies of it was that it didn't do what we wanted it to do in Russia, although I think if you look at some of the neighboring countries, the record is much better. And one of the lessons that should have been learned was a lesson of size and scale, and that we were able to do some things on a small scale, but that a lot of modesty was called for when dealing with a society as large and complex as Russia. And I'll share an anecdote which is not about Russia, but I think it drives home the point pretty well. I was at OSCE in Vienna, and OSCE put on a small business seminar in Kyrgyzstan. Now, I was, I think, 23 at the time, and I had never been near a small business, ever. But I was a Russian speaker. And through the magic of planning, as was noted about US journalists, similarly, the US government had relatively few Russian speakers. So I got sent to Kyrgyzstan to help run a small business seminar, to which my chief contribution was teaching the European delegates, who knew even less about this than I did, how to go out and patronize the local small businesses on the street to buy antiques, homebrew, and other souvenirs.
You know, I'd really like to disagree with some of what's been said. And I think that if there's any criticism that can be made of the American response, it was that maybe we didn't do enough. But we did a lot of very good things. I would point out the International Science and Technology Center, a really valuable small-scale effort to keep weapons scientists from leaving the country and giving up on Russia, giving them civilian research to do in place, maybe small grants that might have touched 50,000 scientists over a decade for a month or two, but gave them some hope. And you know, George Soros and some of his very small grants in those early years were critical, even as things like keeping high school teachers in the high schools teaching math instead of doing other things. And you know, I wrote once and followed around a fellow from the ABA who was doing rule of law work on the early experiment with jury trials, which unfortunately was rolled back. Extremely valuable stuff. So time and again, I looked at some of these and thought, why aren't they bigger? Why aren't we doing more? And frankly, even the large things we did, capital markets and the whole democratic experiment, we could sit and argue all day about whether or not it was done right or fast or slower. But you know, if you take some of the very good work that's been done since, you see that we gave Russia good prescriptions that actually got them moving ahead much faster, even though it seemed difficult, than had they waited. And all you have to do is look at the examples of Belarus and Kazakhstan and realize that they were, in many ways, you know, cut from the same cloth. I think historians will look back on this period at our prescriptions and at our efforts and say we did the right things and we didn't do enough of them, not that we did the wrong things.
Phil, I'm wondering if, as you think of this period, if you think there could have been more of a role for the kind of citizen diplomacy that you were engaged in earlier.
Well, I'm fascinated. Right now, we're in an argument about, I mean, people are mad at Obama because he wants to talk to people. You know, we're preparing our grandchildren for a world where they're going to be looking around, is this the wrong bus I'm on? And I think there are people in the Soviet Union who feel the same way. We did not win the Cold War. The Soviets didn't win the Cold War. We both spent ourselves into weakness and atrophy. I mean, think of what it costs this war. This is what you can do to frighten the American people. It's amazing. The politics of fear works. If you scare the people, they will do the bidding of their leaders. Hermann Goering. Not a, you know, not someone with more than a passing interest in military strategy. So I wish, you know, I wish there could be more. I mean, what could be bad about this? I mean, people will fall in love. There'll be pen pals. There'll be, come on. And also Visa, Vladimir, getting Vladimir. And by the way, the FBI followed him when he was here, especially up in Boston. Is that right, Vladimir?
Yes. Yeah.
That would be along the, what is that? The digital, north of Boston. There's a lot of, I guess, yeah, a lot of development research government.
Yes, Route 128.
So we would have a woman from my office would accompany Vladimir on his speeches, and she would sit in the lobby and wait for the FBI to come and interview her. So this is how crazy it was, really.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 questions, and then we're going to go on to the next segment. So this woman over here and the gentleman in the back, and then we'll go one more round. Go ahead.
Thank you, Blair. I'm Nina Buis, and I was head of the Soros Foundation in those years. Thank you, David, for your kind words. A lot more needs to be done, I think. And I'd like to know what you all think about the future of citizen diplomacy, because we had wonderful beginnings, and Esalen did so much in those days along with the Spacebridge, hot tub diplomacy, helping the astronauts and cosmonauts meet. The Soros Foundation did wonderful things. That wasn't quite citizen diplomacy, that was George Soros diplomacy, which was well worth every penny he spent, I think. What do we do now? You talked about Putin's narrative. What citizens did back then in the Soviet days was to change the narrative by letting citizens talk to other citizens. I think we need to change the narrative in Russia again. And we need to have a dual track, or maybe a triple track, or a quadruple track, where people get to talk to people. I think the lack of drama that Phil talked about, really is true. Soviet citizens were fascinated by America because it was forbidden. Now that it's open, you know, remember Yevtushenko's line, a poet in Russia is more than a poet because he can speak for everyone. Now that you can read Danielle Steele in Russia, who the hell cares what a poet has to say?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we engage Americans and Russians in this extremely important dialogue?
Nina,
Thank you.
That's an excellent question, but that's
I'm
going to be
sorry,
the next section, and I think we'll start off the discussion after the clip with that question. 'Cause this gentleman right here.
Hi. Given the American attitude towards Russia when they invaded Afghanistan, excuse me, the Soviet Union, went into Afghanistan, I'm curious about what the Russian attitude is towards this country, given the fact that our abilities and our attitudes were the same for the same reason. Both were admirable and probably we thought necessary.
Vladimir, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Well, I certainly wouldn't call the Soviet incursion, I think that was the word that was used, into Afghanistan as admirable at all. As far as I know, it was a reaction after the Soviet propaganda offensive against medium-range missiles had failed. The more hawkish part of the Soviet establishment basically said to Brezhnev, look, there's no way to get these people to agree to anything. Let's show some muscle. And showing muscle in that particular case meant going into Afghanistan. And I repeat, it wasn't admirable at all. The Soviets lost that war, and they lost not a few people along the way. But what they lost also was their innocence. And let me make a point of this. Up until that point, the Soviet army was one of the most respected establishments in the country. People really, really respected the military. After that war, that respect went downhill because of many things that happened, and I'm not going to waste your time on this, but that's what did happen. Now, the U.S. forces in Afghanistan today, most Russians really don't care about it. They've lost interest in this. Not a few people say, just wait. The Americans are going to find out what Afghanistan is really about. You can't win in Afghanistan. It's not going to happen. And they're going to get their butts kicked, and we're going to like that because it happened to us and let it happen to them. I think that there are very few people who seriously try to analyze why the United States and why the West is supportive of military activity in Afghanistan. But most people here that I've spoken to, I talk about people in my particular community, they see what's happening in Afghanistan more as a failure. A government that is completely corrupt and the drug trade that has increased by I don't know how many percent over the years. The sale of opium and opiates has gone up 300, 400, 500% during the American military being there. And finally, that the Taliban is just as strong as they ever were. So it's seen here in a very, either with indifference or in a negative light.
Vladimir, on the occasion of Russia's, of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan,
yes,
you spoke out, and you publicly.
Well, yeah, Let me tell you this. I was interviewed by a gentleman who now works for Fox News, one of the more progressive stations in the United States, and he asked me. He said, "Well, Mr. Posner, can you criticize your government?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, for instance."
What year was that?
I said, "Well, this is 1980."
80, okay.
Yeah. And I said, "Well, for instance, the Soviet government supports the death penalty, and I don't." He said, "Oh, yeah, very interesting. What about international relations?" And in my head, I heard checkmate, I said, "Well, Afghanistan." He said, "Yes, Afghanistan." And I said, "I think we'll probably regret this." That was as far as I went. That made the headlines. And I lost my job for a while, and it wasn't like being put in prison or anything, but I really got hit pretty hard for saying that. Now, it turns out I was right, but that had nothing to do with what happened then. So to say that I was not a dissident, Phil, I didn't have the courage to go out in the streets or Red Square and hold up a sign saying, you know, get out of Czechoslovakia or whatever. I could be critical, but I was very careful. I had a family, I had kids, and I wasn't going to destroy whatever I had for those kinds of principles. And I have the deepest respect for people who had the courage to do that and who really suffered. I was very lucky, and thank heavens that Gorbachev came around.
I think now we will move to the contemporary period. We have one last clip to set up, which comes from just a couple of weeks ago. So let's roll the final clip.
Our top story this hour, Russia and the U.S. have signed a much-heralded new nuclear arms treaty, agreeing to slash the world's strategic stockpiles by about a third. So the deal's finally been signed after months of talks. Katerina, is it really a new start for Russia and the U.S.?
Absolutely. This sunny day of April 8, 2010 will definitely go down in history as something more than just a calendar date on which an ambitious arms control treaty was signed. For the United States and Russia, it will be remembered as a fresh start in U.S.-Russia relations. There's so much spoken about reset in the relations between the two countries. Today, Dmitry Medvedev and Barack Obama literally pushed that biggest reset button by signing the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, a fair, a balanced and a much anticipated accord which aims to make the world a safer place to live.
A burden rather than a security asset, a shameful Cold War relic. 65 years after the first nuclear bomb was put into action, things are being viewed very differently.
Start 1 was biased in favor of the Americans, and that was because Gorbachev and Shevardnadze were lobbying for US interests. That wasn't the case this time. Our negotiators could work stress-free. They had the support of the foreign ministry, and there had been no pressure at all from the Kremlin.
Presidents Obama and Medvedev entered stately Spanish Hall in Prague Castle to sign the new treaty and symbolically end a brief era of U.S.-Russian relations marked by indifference, tinged with suspicion. Before the ceremony, the presidents met for 85 minutes and zeroed in on new sanctions to punish Iran for its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Medvedev told Mr. Obama he was on board. Publicly, he outlined Russia's limitations.
Sanctions by themselves seldom obtain some specific results, although it's difficult to do without them in certain situations. But in any case, those sanctions should be smart and aim not only at non-proliferation, but also to resolve other issues.
That means deter, but not oust the Iranian leadership. Russia also opposes moves that would create economic havoc for average Iranians, terms Mr. Obama has accepted. Despite the celebratory atmosphere and Medvedev's sunny declaration the new treaty is a win-win for both countries, skepticism reigns in Prague and throughout Central Europe and Eastern Europe about Russia's military and economic intentions. To reassure, Mr. Obama greeted 11 regional heads of state for a dinner here. The message, better ties with Russia won't shortchange former captives of communism. In Washington, Connecticut's independent Senator Joe Lieberman said in a statement that his vote to ratify this new START treaty is not guaranteed, that he wants assurances from the White House that it will spend enough to sustain and modernize what will be left of the U.S. nuclear stockpile. 41 Republican senators have expressed similar concerns. 67 votes are required to ratify.
Well, you sort of look at that reporting, and we went from sort of a sunny day to cynical and calculated dinner invitations intended to cover over a sellout in Prague, not perhaps for the first time in recent history. So I wanted to ask, how far have we really come from the era in which we had the space bridge in terms of how we report on one another and how we talk about one another? And then I think this is where Nina's question really fits in. The more important follow-on question is what would be a constructive way of moving forward for both Russia and the United States? But Phil,
could I jump in here?
Sure, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know, I really want to say something here. The selection of those two pieces, in my opinion, is somewhat unfortunate. Russia Today is a special group that was created not that long ago to improve the image of Russia abroad. It is an English language television outfit which has native English speakers both from the United States, Canada, and the UK. It is not what Russians see. Russians don't watch English language television. They watch their own. So it would be much fairer to take one of the three main networks, which are state-controlled, I want to underline this, Channel 1 or Channel 2 or Channel 4, and show how they presented this particular thing, in Russian obviously, but you could translate that into English. On the other hand, you take Fox News, which has an agenda. We all know that it has an agenda. And you know it's going to be anti-Russian. You know it in advance. So what I'm saying is even the juxtapositioning of these two reports doesn't really reflect, how should I put this, the full picture at all. It shows a propaganda outfit on the one hand and an agenda outfit on the other hand. So, you know, again, what are we really trying to find here?
Well, that's instructive to me, Vlad. We are suspicious. We have a spin. The last thing you want to do if you're on Fox is say this is a good idea. These people are trapped in a broadcast format that they can't get out of. It's like, you know, for Sean Hannity to say something nice about Barack Obama would be like a rock and roll radio station playing Manavani. It's not consistent with the brand. So now we have the political dialogue in this nation, in a large measure, being provoked or moved by a broadcast format. So it's their idea of getting lots of listeners. And ask Rupert Murdoch, it worked.
And I would also ask you, if you want to change the dialogue, and I think it was Nina Buiz who said we have to change the Russian dialogue. Why don't you change the American dialogue?
Well, we agree.
You know, you're back home. Do it yourself.
That's why we should.
You know, I will try to change. I'll try to change the Russian dialogue. I'll tell you that. But you know, what do you do about Fox News? How is that conducive to any kind of understanding, to any kind of rapprochement between the two countries? I fail to understand that.
Well, David is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I have to ask you to weigh in at this point.
About time we got a Pulitzer in here, but
I think Vladimir's absolutely correct, and I have seen some of these Russia Today broadcasts. They're not typical of anything. You know, I am always still surprised at the good quality of those who are working in journalism in Russia, who are still trying. If you listen to Echo Moskwy, and you know, there certainly are other parallels that we should look to get a better sense of how Russians see us. And I'd also like to add that American journalism is going through a revolution, and it's very difficult for us to sit here today, take a snapshot, look at something on the screen, and draw a conclusion. It's a dynamic revolution of fragmentation. And what once were essentially large, universal brands, the Washington Post, CBS News, NBC, ABC, are breaking up. And Fox is just a shard, a fragment of our society that appeals to the people that watch it. But there are many, many others. And in fact, that's what's happening on our side of the equation here, is that our information world is also in a complete uproar, and we don't really know anytime where to turn to get something that isn't a small bit or a fragment. So this is a really difficult time to put these two pieces up, because neither of them reflects what's actually happening.
So to build on that, I think just one thing I'd say about that Fox report is that actually it's interesting to look that the public response as measured by polls to Obama going to Prague, signing the treaty, doing the nuclear security summit, at which Russia, of course, was a participant, was very positive. So that you wouldn't want to overplay the influence of that Fox-style reporting, although it is there. So taking the points David made and then going back to Nina's question, I had a lot of fun preparing for this by talking to the group of 20-somethings that I supervise in my day job, who all kind of scratched their heads when I said citizen diplomacy. And they said to me, well, you know, we can connect with Russians anytime we want on Twitter and Facebook, and we can follow Russian bands on MySpace, and we can play video games with Russians, or we can play Russian video games, or whatever it is. And we, on the one hand, we recognize that's not the same as real face-to-face conversations, but we can take for granted a tremendous range of contacts with Russians, and anybody else for that matter, and exposure to Russians that the space bridges were novel and interesting in a way that you just couldn't recreate now because of the democratization of information, that you can go out and find a Russian yourself if you want to. So the challenge we face is, what is it that we can organize and offer that you can't get for yourself? Or how can we explain that playing some video game, I'm betraying my lack of interest in the genre, is actually not the same thing as having a deep understanding about another society. And I think that goes to, Vladimir, to some extent what you're getting at is this question of shared purpose. Do we have as American society a shared purpose with Russian society? And I think that's rather unclear. The other sort of interesting development to think about is, where is energy going these days on citizen diplomacy? It's not going to Russia. To a certain extent, where it's going is the Arab world and the Muslim world. And in the same way that the young people who were reading Rick Smith and doing Russian degrees with me 20 years ago are now reading your colleagues' books about Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, they're reading your book too. And studying Arabic at night and trying to find ways to go work at the American University in Baghdad or Beirut. And when I talked to Lisa Shirk, who teaches peace building at Eastern Mennonite University and does a lot of work on citizen diplomacy, and I said to her, well, where do you think, what's the state of the art in citizen diplomacy today that you would tell people in other regions of the world to look at? And she said, this stunned me, she said, reality TV. She said, look at the reality TV shows that are being done for Afghan audiences. And it's actually, Vladimir, quite similar to the program you described of taking an audience through the lives of Muslims in America, which really does, to the extent that, again, you can do this over television, break down barriers, convey an experience that people have no idea of, and provide some powerful visuals to counter stereotypes that folks might have about what life is like. Of course, what it doesn't do is provide the kind of, you show me what's in your purse, you know, you tell me why your government does this immediacy that the space bridges had. But I think looking at those experiences of where you've got people who've identified that mutual misunderstanding is a problem. And then you can harness technology in interesting ways, in interesting 21st century ways to start to address that. And on the US-Russia relationship, we have all the technology. What we don't have is a mutual definition of the problem.
This actually leads me to a question, and maybe I'll start by posing it to Vladimir, about sort of everyday life of 20-year-olds in Russia. And I'm struck by how when we think about the Cold War and we kind of have it carry forward, there's a set of sort of mechanisms and institutions that we have in mind, and yet we have them in mind. I think the people on your staff, the people on my staff, probably the people who work for you, Vladimir, they have their own way of interacting with one another. Yep. And there are the new technologies, or there are new ways of thinking about the world. We live in a world in which hip-hop is the most popular music in the world. We may not like it, but that suggests that we actually live in a very different world than we were in at the height of the Cold War. And I'm wondering, what opportunities are there that exist in this new world? When you think, Vladimir, about the 25-year-olds you know in Russia, what would speak to them?
I don't know that I can answer that question accurately. It's been a long while since I was 20 years old. And you know, even my children, I mean, my daughter's going to be 50. So I really don't have enough contacts. The people who work, who do the show with me that I do, they're in their 30s, early 40s. I don't know those people well enough. I know they're different, and thank heavens they were born outside of the Soviet system. See, one of the things that in the West you tend to forget is that the people who are leaders of of Russia today, whether it's business leaders or political leaders, the vast majority of them were born in the Soviet Union, went to Soviet schools, were members of the Young Pioneers, of the Young Communist League. Many of them were members of the Communist Party. They were shaped by the Soviet system, the people who are in power today. And you cannot cut off your tail. And many of their reactions and their way of looking at the world, including the United States, come from those times. The 20-year-olds that you're talking about, they were born in a different country. They don't even know what it is not to be able to travel. They don't know what the word means. In Russian, there's a word, невыездной. It means untraveling. It means it was about people who were not let out, and that was the majority. These kids don't know what that means anymore. The only people who don't let them out are, for instance, your embassy, who won't give them a visa. but the Russians let them out. They couldn't. So they are different, and thank heavens that they're different. And I think that they're much more open. But again, that's a generalization, because amongst young people, there are some very chauvinistic, very nationalistic, very anti-Western organizations. The skinheads of Russia, for instance, or the so-called national Bolsheviks. These are young people. So they're not uniform. I would simply agree with you that this is a different, they are more different from the older generation than your 20-year-olds are different from their older generation, because they both come from the same system, whereas here they come from two very different systems.
I'm going to open it up in a moment, but as part of this conversation, I guess it was last week, President Medvedev spoke at Brookings, and during the question and answer, he was asked about his use of the internet. And he gave a very interesting response about how he used to get up and sort of watch the news on TV and read the newspaper, and now he goes on the internet. And one of the things about the internet is you no longer have to depend on your advisors for information. You can find it yourself. And we know that Barack Obama very much is a techno fiend of sorts. So it may be that we're entering a world in which it's not just 20-year-olds, but even 40-something-year-old presidents are interacting with one another and with the world around them in very different ways. I don't know, David, you've been looking at leaders for a long time. Do you think there's anything qualitatively different about this moment because of the new technologies?
Absolutely, and certainly my own experience in Russia even recently suggests that the Soviet Union probably could not exist as it did today. You know why? Not because of the things that tried to hold it together like the KGB, but I actually think that Facebook would have defeated the Soviet Union. Facebook has 400 million members worldwide. I think Twitter might have defeated it. And I think if you look at Iran today and Venezuela and China, we're seeing that there is a certain method of soft power that may be able to try to control this digital revolution. But I feel in my gut, in my bones, from people I see and from my own experiences, that it is still an incredibly powerful force for freedom. And it is very, very difficult to defeat it. So I know that there's a lot of dispute about this and how to marshal it on behalf of democracy and our values, but even if you remove the argument about whether you can manipulate it, just look at the power of millions of people in multiple languages on Facebook communicating with each other. There is no way you can seal off a society or a country from the rest of the world. It's a fact of life.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Why don't we open up, and we have time for some questions. We'll go over here in the middle, then we'll come over to the side. We're getting a microphone.
Hi, I'm Mindy Reiser for Vladimir Posner. In terms of the economic catastrophe that has befallen the world, which we are to some degree climbing out of, but not completely, I'm wondering what the response has been in various circles in Russia. Of course, you have the tradition of the oligarchs, which were seen both with emulation and envy and with disdain. And I'm wondering if some of the circles that really were true believers in communism have felt any kind of affirmation by seeing what the excesses of free market economies could lead to. I'd be very interested in your views.
Well, I'd like to make one point before even answering the question. There are no more oligarchs in Russia, at least in the classical sense, because oligarchs were people who not only were wealthy, but also had a lot of political power. And today, the wealthy people in Russia, while certainly tycoons, have no political power to speak of. One of the results, incidentally, of Putin's presidency. So forget about them in the sense of oligarchs. Now, definitely, there are not a few people who kind of laughed and said, see, old man Marx was right. The capitalist system, or the market economy, call it what you want, is based on greed. And they just got too greedy, and that's what we're paying for. And I have to say, I have a lot of respect for Marx. I've read Das Kapital carefully, and he was right in certain respects. He wasn't right about socialism, in my opinion, but he was right about the greediness of capitalism. And look, we've had this crisis. Has a lesson really been learned? Have there been any really serious changes in the structure of the market, in the banks? I don't see them. And the same applies to Russia, by the way, which is doing exactly the same thing as the Western world. People are very bitter. A lot of people have lost everything they had. Not a few banks have gone, smaller banks have gone bankrupt, and the bigger ones have gotten handouts from the government. So I don't think a lesson's been learned, and I do think that the system has this inbuilt factor of greed that really pushes it. In some ways providing some good things, but in other ways leading to the kind of serious economic problems that the world is facing now.
Okay, why don't we go down right here, Wayne?
Wayne Mary, I'd like to raise an issue of an aspect of Russian citizen diplomacy that's notable for its silence, and that is the role of the Russian immigration in the United States. There are several 100,000 Russians who have come to this country since the end of the Soviet Union. This is not Brighton Beach. These are people all over major cities in the United States. They're one of the most successful recent immigrant groups in this country. Many of them are millionaires, several of them are billionaires, and their role in policy influence here in Washington is zilch. They are one of the most ineffectual ethnic groups in this country in terms of affecting public policy. I mean, Nepalese Americans are more effective. Macedonian Americans are better organized here in Washington. And my question is, why are hundreds of thousands of Russians, many of whom have passports, many of whom just have green card status, but who live and work in this country, doing absolutely nothing to try to do what you two gentlemen did in 1985, which is get some communication between our two societies, some understanding, at least here in Washington, of the nature of the mutual interests we have. And for example, what are any of these people going to be doing in trying to get ratification for the START Treaty? Every time I talk to representatives of this Russian immigration here and I raise this issue with them, I just get a shrug. The notion of trying to influence policy in Washington seems irrelevant to them. If you talk to Serbs, you talk to Kosovars, they're all organized and busy. Why is it that the Russian Americans, one of the most successful recent immigrant groups in this country, are so ineffectual as citizen diplomats?
Well, I think the answer might be staring us right in the face. They fled. They didn't come here to participate in politics in the state. They left, partly because they were tired and fed up of that. They came here seeking something else. And it doesn't have anything to do with nuclear weapons. If you look at some of our most successful groups, the Poles or others, you know, unified around hardship, around historical memory. You know, I don't know many Russian immigrants who were sitting around the kitchen table, you know, talking about historical memory. They came for different reasons, and it may take generations.
Yeah, you're describing the trajectory, I think, of every ethnic group. I mean, you can't name an ethnic group that is highly politically influential within 15 years of getting here. Within 15 years of getting here? I agree with David, but I would also say give him a little more time.
I would also add something to that. You know, I would say that one of the things that does not exist today in Russia is a civil society. That is to say, people who say, this is my country, and here's what I want to do about it. Because most of them say, you can't do anything about it. And that's still part of the past, when you couldn't do anything about it. In fact, you were told by the government, we'll take care of everything. You just don't, you know, you don't do anything at all. And I think that's been carried on by these people. Where did they come from? They came from the Soviet Union, most of them. Now, they left for various reasons, because they were Jewish, for instance, and being a Jew in the Soviet Union was a tough deal. They left because they wanted a better life in the sense of more things, more money, things to buy, things to enjoy. But they're not, most of them, now, I don't say all of them, they are not politically active. It's just not part of their past. And there never was a civil society, seriously speaking, in Russia. This is all new. There never was democracy. This is something, again, you have to have some patience with these people. You need a couple, if not more, generations for these things to develop. It took the United States, you know, quite a while before it became a real democracy. And it's going to do the same, it's got the same thing for Russia. And the people who were in the Soviet Union, or even in Russia after the collapse and left, they're still the product of the past. And they still have this feeling, I don't give a damn about anything as long as I have my thing. And you can't fight governments, and it's hopeless. You've got to keep that in mind.
Phil, do you have anything to add? Or?
Well, I remember a woman standing, Vladimir will remember this, front row in this, one of the space bridges. I think it was the first one. And of course, we were all saying, free speech, free speech. And she stood up and she said, free speech, free speech. You can stand up and you can speak. And you can stamp your feet and you can spit. And what good does it do? So I thought, well, cynicism is not exclusive to the United States. Although I think you can hear, this was, of course, 25 years ago, when a woman stood and she said, you know, why are we talking about this? We have our leaders who do this, which is not too far from what my wife's parents used to say in the 50s. If they didn't know what they were doing, they wouldn't be in Washington. Wait a minute. You're not old enough to remember the 50s. I mean, Eisenhower, America, the Marshall Plan, Lend-Lease, we defeated the Nazis with a lot of help and blood from the Russians, the Soviets, and I mean, we were all good in all things. And we thought we were astride the modern world. That's how we thought of ourselves. Exceptionalism, triumphalism. I mean, we were almost messianic. Democracy, democracy, and we turned our back on our own. I mean, the last administration had no patience with the Bill of Rights. You know, all men are created equal unless we're scared. You can't tap your phone unless we're scared. We'll put you in a cage for 5 years. No Red Cross, no letters home, no nothing. Because we're scared. Cruel and unusual, don't worry about it. Miranda, Miranda. It's amazing. If you put the Bill of Rights to this crowd, to a vote, it would pass. I'm not sure you can say that about everybody. Certainly not about the last administration. They had to protect the people, and free speech was kind of a quaint idea, but not very practical. I mean, it's amazing. This is the most fabulous idea, I think. Jeffersonian democracy, hooray. I'm blessed for having been born into it. The people who yell about it the most are the people who turn their backs on it first. And my experience with Vladimir and the Soviet people at the time really brought this home to me. We live on pretense. The troops, the brave troops. The troops come home and the VA doesn't call them back. Now we've got to stop this kidding ourselves. We have become a warrior nation for this reason. We bombed Grenada, for God's sakes. $2 billion a day on defense. Do the math. $2 billion a day.
I think there is one more question, and that there'll be two more questions, and then we'll come up for a wrap-up, and then we may break a few minutes early. Anatol, you had a question?
Yes, Anatol Senkovich. I am intrigued, of course, by this whole notion of narrative of exchange. And of course, as a professor,
You're a professor.
I've been accused of being that, yes. In any case, but the point is, I mean, communication, interactive communication, has always been part of that scene. But of course, technology has made it remarkable. The blog. And I don't mean just the blog in this country or in the West. I have really been involved in the Russian blog. And I can tell you the Russian blog is as interactive, as active as ours. People may be well aware of it. But I think, you know, the notion that Nina Buis raised was, you know, improving the narrative there. I think we have to deal with an interactive narrative. I mean, you know, the internet now is increasingly in sites that are interactive. We have interactive maps. Communication is interactive.
Yes.
Narrative is interactive. Your experiment was interactive. Limited, but it was fundamentally interactive. The State Department has recently put on Twitter and on its webpage because they are expanding communication. They're seeking. In fact, I got an email notice to that effect about a week ago that that's happening. State Department has it clear. The point is, I think the nature of the blog, the nature of the kind of technology of communication, and it happens largely with the 20 and 30 somethings,
right?
And those who trip in their company with pleasure and trials and tribulations, all included. But I think that's really the medium of exchange that is not going to be limited. And in a certain sense, I think what we need to do is we need to bridge the gap. You know, Nina mentioned something about our improving the Russian narrative. We need to improve our narrative. But the point is, it is best improved when it is in an interactive process. That's my point. Mm-hmm. And the blog provides a great opportunity, not without some problems. But I think, you know, the communication that's handed from on high, whether it's Fox or the state government or public or enterprise, it can't compete in that interactive and dynamic with spontaneity. And I think spontaneity is in the blog, if it is allowed to develop, I think provides an avenue for that kind of interactive communication.
Yeah, people don't talk at you. They
can do that too.
Well, but I mean, you're calling for interactive, and I think that's.
Yeah, but it gets checked immediately because there's a response. Somebody will say, "I think that's a good idea," or "I think you're nuts."
And nobody ever said that to Walter Cronkite. That's how the technology has changed us.
Right.
We'll never see another Walter
That's my
Cronkite.
point.
Walter, what is it? What's the answer?
We need to tap into the technology, imperfect though it is, that provides for interactive communication. That's my and narrative. That's my point.
Heather, you have a TV blog. How has this changed your perception of how the world works?
Well, what's fascinating is there are sort of two streams, I would say, in national security policy now. And one is a stream that goes along pretty much as it always did, with the government working pretty much as it always does, although there's a certain amount of frenzy about how can we use Twitter, can we have a blog, can the secretary blog, what does the secretary say on her blog? But the business of government still goes on to a large degree, as it always did. But the sort of second stream that's going alongside and that you don't see unless you know where to look for it is that a lot of reporters and journalists are picking up ideas about what to cover from blogs, but even more now from Twitter. And if you want to know what's about to happen at the White House, you follow the Twitter feed, and folks are tweeting it 5, 10, 15 minutes before it's actually announced at the press conference. You want to know what's going to be on the front page of the Post tomorrow, somebody will probably tweet it. You want to know what's happening here at this forum so you don't have to watch the whole 2.5 hours. Somebody would be tweeting it, except that you asked us to turn off our phones, which prevented me from tweeting the first half of the panel. So there's this interesting way that the blogosphere, which has its own set of rules, which, as you noticed, is much more freewheeling, which has some good things and some really bad things about it as well, is proceeding like an underground river whose consequences seep up into the traditional debate without us necessarily seeing that they do that. And that in some ways is democratizing because a whole lot of people can participate in the debate who didn't before. But in some ways it creates a new set of hierarchies. I mean, a sort of fascinating thing that I discovered while preparing for this panel is that one of the frequent bloggers who works for me says, oh yeah, oh, I didn't tell you this, but the Russian ambassador to NATO is following my Twitter feed. I said, oh, that's fascinating. I wonder why he's doing that. So, you know, the world network in which a Russian diplomat is sitting in Brussels gaining something useful by following the Twitter feed of a 25-year-old sitting in Washington who is a very, very smart guy and a very astute analyst of the political scene, but has never been to Russia, has never been to Brussels, has never been to the Middle East. That's a fascinating world that we live in. And so people who come along and say, oh, this has changed everything, are wrong, and sort of you shouldn't, it doesn't mean you throw out everything you know, it doesn't mean politics works differently or power works differently, but it provides other avenues for influence, and it hastens this process that David was talking about of diffusing things so that it's much harder to get, and if there's no Walter Cronkite, there's no one authoritative blog or tweeter that you can go to and say, okay, now I know what I need to know. It makes our world that much more diffuse and schizophrenic and difficult to follow.
Okay. We're going to go to Nina, and then we'll go to the woman in the back, and then why don't we take both your questions at once, and then we'll come back.
Mine's just a very tiny correction. I don't want to go on record as suggesting that only Russia's narrative needs to be changed. Definitely
Fair enough.
not. We need to change ours too, which is why we need to communicate. Thank you.
Okay. Final question in the back.
Mary Dominic, I had two quick questions, one to Mr. Hoffman. I think in the way you said the word Putinism, there is an anti-Russian bias or an anti-democratic bias because he's a political player there, and maybe you have your reasons for that, and I would be interested to hear them. And the second point, I think I'll drop. Thank you.
Well, let's not put any varnish on what Putin has meant for democracy in Russia. It's a system, go ahead.
Isn't it fair for the Russians to choose social democracy? They are continental European up to the Urals, and maybe they see a better way to do it than the American way, which we tend to impose upon them.
I don't see the choice that they've made as one that they've chosen, first of all. For example, I don't think there's any evidence that they chose to abolish the election of governors or to revert to a one-party state. And I don't see that this has been a choice between some kind of democratic system and social democracy. Actually, in some ways, Russia is more of a social democracy even than we are because of the legacy of the Soviet years. What I was referring to was a system that essentially has rolled back key choices in civil society and electoral democracy. And I think that there's incontrovertible evidence that that was done, and it was not necessarily a choice that they made. Yes, they did have an election. Yes, Putin was elected. He was a legitimate elected leader. That's not my point. But I do think that some of the changes that were made were not what people overtly and explicitly voted for. They were imposed.
Okay, I want to go return to the Spacebridge.
Yeah.
And begin to wrap up. And I'm going to go to Phil and Vladimir last. But let me begin by asking Heather and David, when you reflect back on this period of the mid-1980s, how important was that period for the world we live in now?
I'll answer the question this way. There is absolutely nothing in Gorbachev's personal history to suggest that he would have become Gorbachev. And his quiet observation with Rais's help that allowed him from March of 1985 till the collapse to carry out the revolution from above is one of the reasons we're sitting here having this discussion. And his contribution cannot be underestimated. All of us remember, and I'm sure Vladimir does, the day of the meeting of the First Congress of People's Deputies, that television moment of absolute, riveting attention to the whole country. And I could go on. And, we haven't talked much about that, but Glasnost and Gorbachev, we are still paying homage to that remarkable turn of events.
Yeah. So the stories that we tell ourselves, some of which are accurate and some of which are maybe not all that accurate about how events fell out in that period, have had an enormous global impact on how we think about democracy, how we think democratization happens, what we think can most usefully be done from outside to shape democracy, what we think the role of the state is, in some ways that were very inspiring and very helpful for a generation of people in other places doing the kind of work that Nina and others in the room were doing, and in some ways that have been very damaging and pernicious in terms of some attitudes in America about how democracy can be implanted in places when divorced of the particular historical and social context that the Russian and Eastern European experience had. I think thinking about the space bridges and then the citizen diplomacy experience from that period, what your discussion with the first part of this panel really underlined for me is how much we think what actually happened there was dependent on two particular individuals who had very particular and special places in our respective societies, who were able to be at once very in tune with the public and just a tiny step ahead of it, not an enormous step ahead of it for commercial reasons and other reasons that you both described, but who were able to have an idea that took something that the public actually genuinely felt and advance it an extra half a step. And by doing that, move us forward, not an enormous leap, not to go someplace that no one had ever imagined before, but to crack open a window. And to use, by the way, the best technology that was available at that time to make that possible. And so I think setting that as a frame for how we think about what citizen diplomacy might be able to do in the US-Russian relationship, or for that matter in other relationships right now, actually makes what seems like a really daunting challenge a little easier.
Well, this is a good setup for my final question for Vladimir and for Phil. I ask you to reflect on what you accomplished in personal terms. I'm taken by how both of you described moments at which you felt there might be some negative consequences for undertaking this.
Oh.
And you think about it, it wasn't, it obviously was not the safest thing to do. Not that either one of you in the end paid a significant price. In some ways, maybe you both benefited from it. But when you think about, if it's at all possible to reflect on how, when the idea first emerged, what you thought would happen, and here we are today talking about it, what has this experience really meant for you personally? Phil?
Well, first of all, I just spent 4 years making a documentary titled Body of War. It's the story of a 24-year-old, signed up 9/12, saw the president on the pile, going to get the evildoers. He was in Iraq 5 days and he took a bullet. He's a T4 if you're an anatomist. That's between the shoulder blades. He's paralyzed from the nipples down. He is a rag doll from the chest down. So when you talk about sacrifice, I'm telling you, I've never been this close to what is called a catastrophic injury. And so when people say how brave, it did take some courage. I'm not too humble to deny that. But oh my goodness, to see these kids coming home, not necessarily kids, 30 and 40 something, and I mean, we've had women their faces have been blown off. Blind kids, 20-something blind from this. The injuries are very heinous from this war. That is not your question, however. I'm sorry. I don't know what I thought. I'll tell you what I did learn afterward. Vladimir may have he took a bigger, more dangerous jump than I did. I could have been drummed out of the business. I had that happen to me at MSNBC. You could not be, couldn't have your own show and be against the war in 2002, which is when I was on the air. I was on the air the month of the Iraq War resolution. 77 to 23 in the Senate. 77 to only 23 senators voted against the invasion of Iraq. This is what you can do with the politics of fear. And I look back on this is a chapter of my life. I'll never forget it. I gained a wonderful friend who knows so much, has helped me in so many ways. And, you know, I knew him when he had hair. You didn't hear me. You did hear me. All right. You want to?
Vladimir?
Well, first of all, Gorbachev. He changed the lives of not only millions and hundreds of millions of people in the Soviet Union, he changed the lives of the entire world by what he did. He made mistakes. It wasn't always clear, even to him, I think, what he was exactly doing. But what he did in the long run changed the world, and of that I'm absolutely sure. And one of the little things he did was to make this Spacebridge a possibility. Now let me make a point. Phil Donahue was extremely well known in the United States. As you say, he was an icon. I was not known at all in the Soviet Union. I worked for the North American Department of Radio Moscow. People who worked in the foreign radio service, we called this the tomb of the unknown soldier, because nobody knew us. We were all for foreign consumption. So in the Soviet Union, nobody knew me. So I appeared out of nowhere, and overnight I became this incredibly popular figure because of the novelty of what had happened. Why did I do it? Well, I grew up in the United States. I spent my childhood in New York City. I was the all-American kid from New York City. It was a place I loved. And one of the things that really got to me was, what can I possibly do to bring these two countries together? It's a very emotional thing, and I don't think most of you, or maybe none of you, have ever experienced anything like that, when you really belong to two different countries and they're at each other's throats. And here was this opportunity. And I jumped at it. And it wasn't, it was just about what can I personally do to make something happen. So that was what it was for me. And then it turned out to be the beginning of a great career, which is thankfully still going on. And the creation of a great, great friendship with Phil, who I see at least once a year. We always spend the New Year together. And just a feeling of, what can I say, having done one thing, at least, in my life that I'm proud of. So it's a big, big thing, if you look at the Gorbachev years and all that, and it's a very small, personal thing, if you look at it another way. That's the only answer I can give you.
Well, I said this would be a remarkable afternoon, and it has been. I'd like to thank Evelyn for bringing the idea to us and all of her colleagues, and I'd like to thank David and Heather, Phil, and I have to say it's late in Moscow, and the plan was that there was going to be another New Year's celebration here with Phil and Vladimir, but the volcano intervened. But I'm very glad that Vladimir was willing to play along with us and join us, and I'd like to thank all of you for staying, and please, those of you who aren't on the other side of the world, please join us in the reception room that's taking place in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
See you, Vlad. Thank you.